It was the most powerful military the world had ever seen. The largest economy, the best technology, total control of the skies, and it lost. For nearly 2 decades, the United States poured its strength into a small country in Southeast Asia and could not win. How does that happen? How does a superpower with overwhelming firepower lose to a far weaker enemy? The answer changed the way the world understands war itself. Let's break it down. To understand Vietnam, you have to start with the Cold War. After the Second World War, the great fear in Washington was the spread of communism. Leaders believed that if one country fell, its neighbors would follow, one after another, like a row of toppling dominoes. Vietnam had just won its independence from France after a long and bitter colonial war. But the country was split in two, a communist North, led by Ho Chi Minh, and a non-communist South, backed by the United States. The dividing line ran along the 17th parallel. In the North, a determined government dreamed of uniting the whole country under its rule. In the South, a fragile state struggled to survive, and caught between them, a growing insurgency. At first, the American role was small: advisors, money, and weapons to prop up the South. But the situation kept deteriorating. Then, in 1964, came a turning point. After a reported clash between American and North Vietnamese forces in the Gulf of Tonkin, the United States dramatically escalated its involvement. President Lyndon Johnson committed American combat troops on a massive scale. Soon, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were on the ground. The most powerful nation on Earth was now fully at war, and on paper, it should have been over quickly. But Vietnam was not a war of front lines and grand battles. It was something the American military was not built to fight. The enemy rarely stood and fought in the open. The Viet Cong guerrillas blended into the population, struck from ambush, and vanished back into the jungle and the villages. There was no clear front to push, no capital to capture that would end the war. Supplies and reinforcements flowed south along a vast, hidden network of jungle paths known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, winding through neighboring countries, almost impossible to cut off. The Americans answered with overwhelming technology: helicopters, artillery, and one of the largest bombing campaigns in history. And still, it was not enough. You can win every battle and still lose a war if the enemy simply refuses to quit and is willing to absorb losses that no Western democracy ever could. In early 1968, the North launched a massive, coordinated surprise attack across the South during the Vietnamese New Year holiday. It is remembered as the Tet Offensive. On the battlefield, it was a costly failure for the North. Their forces suffered enormous casualties and were pushed back. But the real battlefield was somewhere else entirely. For years, the American public had been told the war was being won. Then they turned on their televisions and saw fighting in the streets, even at the American embassy. It was the first war broadcast into living rooms night after night, and the gap between the official story and what people saw shattered public trust. Tet was a military defeat for the North and a political victory, because the other front in this war was inside America itself. As the casualties mounted and the years dragged on with no end in sight, opposition grew. Massive demonstrations filled the streets. A generation began to ask what the war was for. This is the heart of the lesson. The North Vietnamese could not defeat the United States in open battle, but they understood something crucial. They did not have to. They only had to outlast America's will to keep fighting. By the early 1970s, the United States was looking for a way out. The strategy shifted to Vietnamization, handing the fighting back to South Vietnamese forces while American troops withdrew. In 1973, a peace agreement was signed in Paris, and the last American combat troops came home. But the war did not end. Without American support, the South could not hold. In the spring of 1975, Northern forces swept toward the southern capital, Saigon. In the final hours, helicopters lifted desperate evacuees from rooftops as the city fell. The war was over. Vietnam was united under the very government America had spent a generation trying to stop. The cost had been staggering. Millions of Vietnamese died, north and south. Tens of thousands of American soldiers never came home. A region was scarred for decades. And here is the lesson the world took from it, one that still echoes in every conflict since. Military power is not the same as victory. The strongest army can be defeated by an enemy who is patient, who knows the ground, and who is simply willing to endure longer. Vietnam taught a generation of generals a hard truth, that you cannot bomb away an idea, and that the will to fight can matter more than the means to fight. It is a lesson that great powers keep having to learn again and again. The Vietnam War showed that the nature of war was changing, that raw firepower had limits, and that the side with the most technology does not always win. But technology never stops evolving, and today, a new weapon is rewriting the rules of the battlefield all over again, one that fights without a pilot, without a soldier in the cockpit at all. The drone, how it changed modern war, is our next story. Subscribe, and we'll see you there.